Well, good evening and welcome to our Tuesday night Bible study in the book of Isaiah as we go through his prophecies. What I'd like to do is begin actually by reading the chapter with you, the verses that we're looking at in Isaiah chapter 9. Okay. Do you know what? I'm going to read from the last verse of chapter 8. Because interestingly, the Masoretic text, which is the Hebrew text, it begins chapter 9 here in the last verse of chapter 8. So that's chapter 8 and verse 22. And they will look to the earth, but behold distress and darkness, gloom and anguish, and they will be thrust into thick darkness. As we enter chapter 9, the situation changes. But there will be no gloom for her who was in anguish. In the former time, he brought into contempt the land of Zebulun and the land of Naphtali. But in the latter time, he has made glorious the way by the sea, the land beyond the Jordan, Galilee of the nations. The people who walked in darkness have seen a great light. Those who dwelt in the land of deep darkness, on them the light has shone. You have multiplied the nation, you have increased its joy. They rejoice before you as with joy at the harvest, and they are glad when they divide the spoil. For the yoke of his burden and the staff of his shoulder, the rod of the oppressor you have broken, as on the day of Midian. For every boot of tramping, and every warrior in battle tumult, and every garment rolled in blood, will be burned as fuel for the fire. For unto us a child is born, unto us a son is given. Well, that's quite a chapter, isn't it? Interestingly, as Isaiah speaks, he speaks in the past tense about something that hasn't yet occurred. He speaks of future hope and deliverance and promises that a great light will shine in the darkness. As I said, it seems better aligned to begin with the last verse of chapter 8 as we unpack chapter 9. And as Isaiah speaks into the gloom and darkness to bring hope to the people who are suffering under God's hand of judgment, with the promise that to those who are in anguish, it will be over. And although the promised invasion of the northern kingdom has yet to occur, Isaiah looks to the future beyond this imminent invasion, even though it is just upon the horizon, and it will bring gloom and anguish. He speaks about the future as if this has already happened, because he looks at these things through the prophetic lens. And through the prophetic lens, often the prophets spoke into the present as if they're looking back to the past, and sometimes they were looking back to past events. And then they also look forward and have future fulfillment. Some of them, perhaps, that work that way, but not all of them. But it does here. He's speaking to a future event as if what has yet to happen has occurred. Well, that's a grammatical conundrum, I think. But anyway, what it is a clear example of what it means for God to be with his people, for God to be Emmanuel, because he is with his people even as he executes judgment upon them. Isaiah explains that the Lord is showing his contempt for the people who live in the northernmost territories of Israel. However, the light is coming. And he speaks to the tribes who first come under his judgment. That's Zebulon and Naphtali. Why? Well, perhaps because at least Naphtali is the northernmost territory, and also Zebulon is far north also. But maybe if we look at 2 Kings 15, we would see a little bit more background. 2 Kings 15, reading verses 27 to 29. In the 52nd year of Azariah, king of Judah, Pekah, the son of Remaliah, began to reign over Israel in Samaria. And he reigned for 20 years, and he did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. He did not depart from the sins of Jeroboam, son of Nebat, in which he made Israel to sin. In the days of Pekah, king of Israel, Tiglath-Pileser of Assyria came and captured Eion, and then it goes on to say the cities and list the cities that are going to be captured. In the text, there's a note of irony because the northernmost territory is Naphtali. And when we read a list of the names of the cities that were conquered, the first placed on the list is a city called Eion. Except this place is only mentioned 3 times in the Old Testament. And it's only in the descriptions of the Assyrian conquest and the areas that Syria was going to take. It is a note of irony because Naphtali was the name given to the son that was born to Rachel by her servant. When Rachel could no longer bear children, she schemed and she gave her servant to her husband, and a child was born. And this is what we read in Genesis 30, verse 8. Then Rachel said, "With mighty wrestlings I have wrestled with my sister and prevailed." So she called his name Naphtali. And the meaning of the word Naphtali means my struggle. And as we've just read, she prevailed. But Eion, on the other hand, means ruin. And that's exactly what happened to Naphtali. The territory named for the son who was the fruit or the victory of her prevailing and wrestling with God gets called Eion. And so the victory has turned to ruin. It's a sad nod to what the Lord wants to communicate. He wants to communicate that his judgment is coming because of his displeasure, because his people would not repent of their sins. But back in Isaiah, we're told that Zebulon and Naphtali would be conquered first, but would also experience the glory of the Lord first. Now that gets really interesting because we read in Matthew's Gospel, chapter 4, reading from verse 12. And when he heard, that's Jesus, when he heard that John had been arrested, he withdrew into Galilee, leaving Nazareth. And he went and lived in Capernaum by the sea, in the territory of Zebulon and Naphtali, so that what was spoken by the prophet Isaiah might be fulfilled. The land of Zebulun and the land of Naphtali by the way of the sea beyond the Jordan, the Galilee of the Gentiles. To me, this connection is marvelous because the place where the Jewish people were first captured and deported to Assyria is the place where the ministry of Jesus begins. It's worth noting that Nazareth, which was where the parents of Jesus came from and where he grew up, was located in Zebulon. And after being tempted by Satan in the wilderness and hearing of the death of John the Baptist, we read that he leaves Nazareth and goes to Capernaum, which was at the northern tip of the Galilee, in what was the territory of Naphtali. There's a glorious symmetry in this. What came to those who first experienced loss was that they got to first experience the meaning of Emmanuel, God with us, in the person of Jesus, the Son of God. What we see from the prophets, time and time again, is that the people of God forsook his ways and unfortunately experienced the hand of his discipline. But what I love about the prophets is they not only reveal the promises of God to comfort, to encourage, but they reveal the heart of God. I want to quote a couple of verses from Jeremiah, and I want you to hear God's pain at the unfaithfulness of his people, but at the same time see his great love for them. Reading from Jeremiah chapter 12, verse 7. I have abandoned my house. I have forsaken my inheritance. I have given the beloved of my soul into the hand of her enemies. Do you hear that? God calls the people of Israel the beloved of his soul. And because of their sin, he has had to abandon his house and forsake his inheritance. However, that's not the end of the story. We only have to read a few verses further down in verse 15 and 16. Yet it will come to pass, after I have uprooted them, that I will again have compassion on them, and I will bring them back, each one to his own inheritance, each one to his own land. So it will come to pass, if they diligently learn the ways of my people, to swear by my name, as the Lord lives, just as they taught my people to swear by Baal, they will be built up in the midst of my people. Here's a question that I asked myself as I was reading this. Does the Lord feel any differently about sin in our lives as he did about the sin in the lives of his people? Has anything about the unchangeable God changed? Isn't he the same yesterday, today, and forever? And when we think about the cost of our sin, we see the hope that the prophets gave to the people of Israel, fulfilled in the person of Jesus, become our inheritance. For me, the key idea is that in the midst of darkness and pain, God offers hope to the hopeless. And because this prophecy is ultimately fulfilled in Jesus, because according to John 1, he is the light that shines in the darkness. I think the Lord would encourage each of us to always hold on to hope and to encourage others to hold on to hope too. The psalmist gives us a really good reason to do this. In Psalm 33 and verse 18, we read, "Behold, the eye of the Lord is on those that fear him, on those who hope in his steadfast love." You see, the promises of God are to be the source of our hope. Well, let's get back to Isaiah and what he was saying. Now, he has a word of prophecy for the Galilee, effectively, because the Galilee was made up of the northern tribes from Naphtali, moving down through Zebulon and down beside the Galilee and right down into the south in Judea. Well, when I was reading this through some of my older notes on this passage, I had some quotes from R.T. France, who in his Gospel of Matthew, he laments and he writes, "Readers of the New Testament often know little about the geopolitical world of the first century. The Jews were not an undifferentiated community living amicably in the part of the world that we call the Holy Land. They weren't simply united in their resentment of the political imposition of Roman rule of which they were all equally subject. So what was Galilee like by the time of Jesus? It looked very different from when Isaiah was speaking. Firstly, it's worth noting that as a result of the Assyrian invasion and the subsequent Babylonian invasion, only the religious spoke Hebrew. Aramaic was the language of the people who lived in the north in the region of the Galilee. That means that Yeshua, Jesus, who grew up in Nazareth, grew up speaking Hebrew and Aramaic. And when he preached to the inhabitants in Galilee, he would have preached in Aramaic. Now, racially or ethnically, the area, as he puts it, as R.T. France puts it, the area of the former northern kingdom of Israel had ever since the Assyrian conquest in the 8th century BC, a more mixed population within which the more conservative Jewish areas like Nazareth and Capernaum stood in close proximity to largely pagan cities, of which in the 1st century became the new Hellenistic centers of Tiberias and Sepphoris, these being chief examples. Isaiah, you see, foresaw that Israel, well, this region of the Galilee, he calls it Galilee of the Gentiles, would be populated by pagan cities. And this is why it's called Galilee of the Gentiles. Some of our modern translations write it as the Galilee of the nations, with the implication being that with the coming of Jesus and the preaching of the gospel throughout Galilee, that the gospel was going to be not just for the people of Israel, but for the nations. However, in the Greek Septuagint, the word ethnos is usually translated as Gentiles. And I think really that's a more appropriate translation for our New Testament here, because this was an area that was populated by these pagan cities. Now, not only did Isaiah foresee this, but there's another reason why maybe Zebulon and Naphtali were also, what am I looking for? I know. Why were they among the first to judgment, and why had they so easily been populated by Gentiles? Well, it might go all the way back to the conquest of the land, because in Joshua, we read that they failed to expel the pagan tribes from their territories. And you can read that in Judges chapter 1, verses 28 through 36. And there's a list of the areas where the Canaanites were allowed to remain and where they failed to honor God's instruction in getting rid of all of the Canaanites from their territories. Well, let's get back to going through Isaiah chapter 60. Now we're at verse 2. Arise and shine, for the light has come. The glory of the Lord has risen upon you. Isn't that a glorious verse that comes from Isaiah 60? And we're going to connect that to what we're seeing in Isaiah chapter 9. So in chapter 9, the people who walk in darkness have seen a great light. Those who dwelt in the land of deep darkness, on them the light has shone. So what you can see is the verse that I've just read from Isaiah 60 is almost a repeat. Now, it's worth also remembering that when the hearers of Jesus listened to his preaching, and when, for example, Matthew says it was in order to fulfill what the prophet had spoken, they knew that prophecy and they went straight to it, and they would have compared it to what was being said. Now, Motier, in his commentary, suggests how this joy and this light in chapter 6 is to be experienced. And he talks about having three solutions. And the first one is we find in verse 3. And it begins with the light. They've seen the light, but what does it mean? They rejoice. And in verse 3 and 4, we have the first thing, the first solution to how they experience joy in verse 3, because the light has come. It's because in verse 4, the yoke of his burden and the staff for his shoulder and the rod of his oppressor you have broken, as in the day of Midian. So what is being spoken of here is freedom and liberation from their enemies. Now, the yoke of his burden, scholars think is a reference to the Egyptian slavery. And the rod that is broken, as in the day of Midian, is a reference to the way in which this is going to happen. So the reference to the day of Midian is a reference to Gideon. Now, Gideon in Judges 7 takes a very small company, I think it's only 300 soldiers, to go against the Midian army. And they go with their trumpets, they go with their clay pots to make a noise, and they have a rallying cry. And the rallying cry was, "A sword for the Lord and for Gideon." Now, it wasn't just that they could shout loudly or blow their horns loudly. It was that they went out in the power of God. So it wasn't the size of the army that mattered. What mattered was going out in the power of God and winning the victory. And I think there's a spiritual principle in that for all of us, that no matter what we're experiencing, no matter what we're facing, if we try and do it in our own strength, we will fail. But if we go in the strength of the Lord, we will see victory. And then, of course, we see them not just experiencing liberation, but entering into the fruits of victory. And the fruits of victory here are this expression of every warrior's boot and every cloak rolled in blood is going to be fuel for the fire. Now, in Joshua, there's a reference to help us understand what that means. In Joshua chapter 11 and verse 6, the Lord speaks to Joshua and says, "Do not be afraid of them, for tomorrow at this time, I will give over all of them slain to Israel. You shall hamstring their horses and burn their chariots with fire." In other words, every warrior's boot and all of the accoutrements of the army are described as fuel for the fire. And simply put, this is what you did when you conquered an army. You destroyed all of his weaponry. You made it impossible for him to gather a new army quickly. He would have to start from scratch. So not only are they to enjoy liberation, but they will have the confidence that this war will be over and it will be a victory that is utterly complete. But perhaps it's also a verse, a thought that goes back to a prophecy in chapter 2 and verse 4. He will judge between the nations and decide disputes for many peoples, and shall beat swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nations shall not lift up war against nation, and neither shall they learn any more. Well, that is the end time victory, the end time peace that we are looking to in the Messiah. But of course, verse 6 is the third point. It's the birth of the Son. In these verses, I think the Lord is asking us to look to him to bring peace. The psalmist understood this when he wrote in Psalm 47, verse 9, he makes wars to cease to the ends of the earth. He breaks the bow and shatters the spear. He burns the chariots with fire. The psalmist knew that at the end of the day, the Lord is sovereign over the earth. The prophet Zechariah understood that what the psalmist was saying comes through the Messiah. In Zechariah chapter 9 and verse 10, we read this, I'll cut off the chariot from Ephraim and the war horse from Jerusalem, and the battle bow shall be cut off, and he shall speak peace to the nations. He shall rule from sea to sea, from the river to the ends of the earth. Wow, that's quite a declaration. Note that all of this territory will belong to Messiah, and he will rule over it. And it's worth noting, perhaps for us in these days, that even as this war in Israel is hopefully coming to an end, there is territory that has not yet returned to her. But this is the hope and this is the truth that we hold on to, that one day the Lord will restore it all in the Messianic age, in the age to come. And the Messiah will be the one who's responsible for bringing in this new era of peace, which will first, of course, be experienced by those who put their hope in him. Wow. I want to look a little bit at the theme of light. I think that there's so much in this chapter that we could focus on, but let's take a moment to look at the light. It's likely, as I said, that when Matthew quotes Isaiah 9, that people would automatically go to those key verses. And I showed you that there's a real parallel between Isaiah 9 and Isaiah 60. So I want to read Isaiah 60 for a moment. Arise and shine, for your light has come, and the glory of the Lord has risen upon you. For behold, darkness shall cover the earth, and thick darkness the peoples. But the Lord will arise upon you, and his glory will be seen in you. Now, interestingly, this verse in the Talmud, it's written that the light that's in this passage, the light that comes, well, that's the Messiah. It literally states the light that dwells with him is the Messiah. I suppose you could also perhaps think about another parallel verse in Daniel chapter 2. He reveals deep and hidden things. He knows what lies in darkness, and light dwells with him. The Lord is light. And I want to not go too far here because we'll come back to this later in Isaiah. But the light of Messiah. Now, what did the audience, the hearers, when Matthew's writing, what were they understanding? His audience would have believed that the light, the glory of God, would be the light of Messiah, that Messiah will shine on his people. And I don't think we can not consider the glory of God in the tabernacle and how the presence of God, there was a manifestation of the presence of God through light. And of course, the Jewish community called that the Shekinah, the shining of God's glory and the manifestation of the presence of his glory with his people, accompanying them out of slavery in Egypt to the promised land. I think that links beautifully to Yeshua's own claim in John 8 that he is the light of the world. and that all who follow him will not walk in darkness, but have the light of life. You know, this was John the author of John's Gospel. It was his claim in verses 4 and 5 of chapter 1. In him was life, and that life was the light of men. The light shines in the darkness, but the darkness has not overpowered it. And in verse 9, John wrote, the true light coming into the world gives light to every man. It's worth remembering that this region was considered by those in Jerusalem to be less literate, less observant of God's law. But it was also from this region, as we noted earlier, that the tribes in the northern territories were first carried off into captivity. It's worth remembering that when Jesus spoke in Nazareth, he said he came to bring good news. This is the message of redemption. In Isaiah 61, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me, the Spirit of God is upon me, because the Lord has anointed me to preach good news to the poor. This is what redemption is. And I feel quite challenged as I've been reading through this tonight, because God really wants us, just as there's a reason why all of these scriptures are left for us. One, it shows us that God is faithful to his word, and he does what it says on the tin. He carried off Zebulon and Naphtali first, and he promised that to them would come salvation first, and it did. He chose that as the birthplace of his son and the place of his first ministry. The light came to them first. And the wonder of this is that not only does God do what it says on the tin, what he's promised and what he says he will do, but that testimony is there to encourage us to be able to hold on to him and his promises during our own dark times. Because just as he was faithful to his word then, he is faithful to his word now, because he is the never-changing, eternal God. And what he has given us as the gift of prophecy through his living word, we are to take hold of and live by and to encourage our hearts with.